The afternoon had started like any other Tuesday in Norman, Oklahoma. The sky was that particular shade of green that long-time residents recognized as dangerous. The sirens had wailed 20 minutes earlier. Most people had gone to their shelters, to their basements, to their safe rooms. But Robert Patterson had waited too long to move his family. He was in the garage when the light changed. One moment he was holding a ladder, thinking about the gutter he'd planned to clean that weekend. The next moment the entire world was moving sideways. Robert's body was lifted off the ground. He felt it before he understood it, that sensation of weightlessness, of the fundamental laws of physics reversing themselves. He was flying, thrown like a toy, tumbling through space that should have been solid but wasn't anymore. His last conscious thought, before everything went dark and chaotic, was of his daughter Sarah. Was she in the shelter? Had she made it? 3 seconds. That's how long the tornado was on the ground near Robert's house. 3 seconds of 160-mile-per-hour winds. 3 seconds that changed everything. Robert woke to silence. That was the first thing that registered. Not pain, though there was pain, sharp and everywhere. Not confusion, though there was that too. But silence. The absence of the sound that had defined those 3 seconds. He was on the ground. Debris was on top of him. Wood, insulation, something sharp pressing against his left shoulder. Rain was falling. Gentle rain in the aftermath of violence. "Robert?" A voice, distant. "Robert, where are you?" His wife. That was Linda's voice. "Here," Robert tried to call out, but his voice was barely a whisper. He tried again. "Here. I'm here." He heard movement, the sound of Linda pushing through debris. Then her face was above his, streaked with dirt, eyes wide with a fear that would stay with Robert for the rest of his life. "Don't move," Linda said. "I'm calling 911. But Robert wasn't thinking about calling for help. He was thinking about Sarah. He was thinking about his mother. He was thinking about the house. The brick house that had been built in 1987, that had weathered every storm until this one. The house was gone. When the emergency responders arrived, they found Robert with a broken left arm, 3 broken ribs, and a concussion. They found Linda physically unharmed but in shock. They found Robert's 16-year-old daughter Sarah in the basement shelter, where she'd gone when the sirens first sounded, traumatized but alive. They found Robert's mother, Margaret, in what used to be the living room. The entire front section of the house had been stripped away. The walls were gone. The roof was gone. But somehow, and the emergency responders would later struggle to explain how, the old dining table had remained standing, buried under debris. And on that table, protected by nothing but chance and the angle of falling timber, sat Margaret's Bible, the leather-bound book her parents had given her 60 years ago. The Bible that had traveled with her through 3 marriages, 5 children, 7 grandchildren, and now, through a tornado that had demolished everything else in her life. It was untouched, not a page bent, not a corner creased. In the midst of total destruction, it sat there like a message. The hospital released Robert after 5 days. His ribs would heal in 6 weeks. His arm would be in a cast for 8. His concussion would fade, though he'd have occasional headaches for months. What wouldn't fade was the memory of those 3 seconds. Robert sat in a temporary apartment, a small 2-bedroom place that the Red Cross had helped him secure while they figured out what came next. Linda was in the kitchen, making coffee that neither of them particularly wanted. Sarah was in the small bedroom, trying to do homework, but mostly staring at her laptop screen. Margaret sat on the edge of the couch, holding her Bible. She hadn't let go of it since they'd found it. Not when the paramedics were checking her for injuries. Not during the ride to the hospital, not in the days afterward. The Bible was in her hands constantly, a talisman against the chaos. "Mom, you should rest," Linda said, bringing Margaret a cup of tea. Margaret looked up, and Robert saw something in his mother's face that he'd never seen before. Not fear. Margaret had weathered harder things than this in her 82 years. But something like confusion, like she was trying to understand something that didn't make sense. "The whole house," Margaret said quietly. "Everything gone. But this," she held up the Bible, "this didn't budge." "You were lucky," Robert said. He was sitting in an armchair, his broken arm resting on a pillow, pain medication making everything feel slightly distant. Lucky, Margaret repeated, as if testing the word. That's what they keep saying. We were so lucky. We were, Linda said firmly. We're all alive. That's what matters. But Robert understood what his mother wasn't saying. Luck implied randomness. Luck implied that there was no reason they'd survived, and the Johnson family 2 blocks over had lost their teenage son when a piece of debris had come through their shelter. Luck meant that the Bible's survival was meaningless, just another random outcome of chaotic physics. Margaret didn't believe in meaningless. That first night in the apartment, after Linda and Sarah had gone to bed, Robert found Margaret in the small living room, reading by lamplight. "Can't sleep?" Robert asked, settling into the armchair. "Haven't been sleeping much," Margaret admitted. She held up the Bible. "I keep reading, looking for something." "For what?" "I don't know exactly. Comfort, maybe, understanding, a reason why this happened." Robert had spent enough time with his mother to know this wasn't really a question. Margaret had lived through her husband's cancer, her daughter's divorce, the death of a grandson in a car accident. She knew that terrible things happened without reason. She was searching for something else. "The Bible doesn't explain tornadoes," Robert said gently. "No," Margaret agreed, "but it does talk about what we do after the storm, how we pick up the pieces, how we keep going." She turned to him, and Robert was struck by how small his mother looked in that moment. Not physically small. Margaret was a tall woman, always had been, but diminished somehow, reduced by what had happened to her. "I spent 50 years in that house," Margaret said. "Your father and I raised our children there. I buried your father there in my heart because I'd see him everywhere, in the kitchen where he'd make his terrible coffee, on the porch where he'd sit in the evenings. I thought that house was permanent. I thought it would outlast me." "Houses are just things," Robert said. "I know that," Margaret said. "Rationally, I know that. But it doesn't feel true. It feels like the world should have rules. It feels like if you're careful, if you do things right, you should be protected from this kind of randomness." Robert didn't have an answer for that. He'd been thinking the same thing. He'd been a careful man, maintained his insurance, updated his emergency kit, had a shelter prepared. And it hadn't mattered. The tornado had come, and in 3 seconds it had erased decades of accumulated life. "Maybe the rule is different," Margaret continued, looking back at her Bible. "Maybe the rule is that we survive, and then we figure out how to go on living." The insurance adjuster came the next week. His name was David. He was in his 50s, and he'd processed hundreds of tornado claims over his career. He moved through the wreckage with a clipboard, taking photos, making notes. Robert walked alongside him, trying not to feel angry at every notation David made. This wasn't David's fault. David was just doing his job. But watching someone catalogue the loss of his life in bullet points and photographs felt deeply personal and deeply wrong simultaneously. "Foundation damage is extensive," David noted. "Structural engineer will need to assess whether anything is salvageable." "The house can't be saved?" Robert asked, though he already knew the answer. "Almost certainly not, but I need the engineer's report to process the claim. You're looking at a total loss." Total loss. The phrase seemed to encompass more than just property damage. It felt like a statement about Robert's entire life. That evening, Robert sat with his family in the temporary apartment and opened his laptop. He pulled up the insurance company's website and started the documentation process. Amount of the mortgage, $237,000. Estimated home value, $425,000. Insurance coverage, $375,000 with a $10,000 deductible. So they'd get $365,000 to rebuild a life. Sarah came and sat beside him, looking at the numbers on the screen. "Is that enough?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Robert said honestly. "Depends on how much construction costs now. Depends on a lot of things." Linda joined them, bringing her own list. Items she'd been tracking since the tornado. Things they'd lost. Some she could assign a monetary value to, others she couldn't. "My grandmother's quilt," Linda read from her list. $300 in photos, not insured. The letters your grandfather sent me from Vietnam, my wedding dress, all of it, gone. She looked up from the list, and Robert saw tears in her eyes. The stupid thing is, I don't even care about most of the monetary value. It's the things that can't be replaced that I miss. Robert understood. He'd already found himself grieving objects that had no intrinsic value. A coffee mug he'd bought on vacation in 1995. A jacket his father had worn, a journal where he'd written his thoughts during college, capturing a version of himself that no longer existed. The tornado hadn't just taken their house. It had taken the physical containers of their memories, the objects that held meaning, the tangible proof of their accumulated lives. Margaret came into the living room carrying her Bible. It was becoming a constant presence, something she held like other people might hold a security blanket. "I've been thinking," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from them, "about what we actually lost and what we still have." She opened the Bible to a page marked with a ribbon. "Listen to this. We brought nothing into the world, and we will certainly not take anything out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that." "Mom," Robert said gently, "I appreciate the sentiment, but we need more than food and clothing. We need a house. We need to rebuild." "Of course," Margaret said, "but I think what this is saying, what I'm understanding from all of this, is that the things that really matter aren't things. They're people. They're memories. They're the relationships we have." "That's a nice thought," Linda said carefully, "but it doesn't pay the mortgage on a new house." "No," Margaret agreed, "but it means that even though the house is gone, we're not ruined. We still have each other. We can rebuild a house. But rebuilding people, that's much harder. That's what I'm grateful for." Robert wanted to argue with his mother. He wanted to point out that philosophical acceptance didn't solve practical problems. But looking around the small apartment at his family, all alive, all together, he recognized that Margaret had a point, even if it was an incomplete one. They'd survived. That was the foundation. What they built from here was up to them. 3 weeks after the tornado, the church reached out to Margaret. Pastor Tom called her at the apartment, offering his condolences and inviting her to the Sunday service. The church community wanted to support her, he said. They wanted to help the family rebuild. Margaret thanked him, but didn't commit. Robert found this interesting because his mother had been attending the same church for 30 years. She'd taught Sunday school, organized fundraisers, helped with community outreach. Church wasn't something Margaret did for convenience. It was central to how she understood her place in the world. "Why won't you go?" Robert asked her one evening. Margaret was sitting by the window reading her Bible as usual. She looked up at him, and Robert saw conflict in her expression. "Because I'm angry," she said finally, "and I don't know if I'm allowed to be angry at God while sitting in God's house." "So you think God caused the tornado?" "No," Margaret said. "I don't think God causes natural disasters. That's not what I believe. But I also can't help the feeling that God could have stopped it, that if I'd prayed harder, believed more deeply, lived more faithfully, God would have protected us." Robert recognized this as the core theological struggle, the problem of suffering, the question of why bad things happen to good people. He'd heard versions of this argument his whole life, and he'd never found a satisfying answer. "Do you think you deserved this?" Robert asked. "Do you think you deserved to lose your house?" "No," Margaret said. "Do you think the Johnsons deserve to lose their son?" "God, no. Absolutely not. That family is good people." "So why are you blaming yourself?" Robert pressed. "Why are you assuming that faith alone could have prevented a natural disaster?" Margaret closed her Bible. "Because it's easier to blame myself than to accept that the world is fundamentally chaotic. It's easier to think I could have done something different than to accept that sometimes random, terrible things happen to random people, and there's nothing anyone can do about it." Robert sat across from his mother, understanding the weight of what she was saying. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "I'm reading the Bible, looking for answers, but I keep finding the same message over and over. Suffering happens. Bad things happen, but we're not alone in it. God doesn't prevent suffering, but God is present in it. God is with us through it. She paused. And that's something, I guess. It's not the protection I wanted. It's not the promise I thought faith offered, but it's something. That Sunday, Margaret agreed to go to church. The congregation welcomed her with genuine warmth. People hugged her, cried with her, offered help. They passed around a collection plate specifically designated for Margaret's family. The pastor, during his sermon, talked about the resilience of faith in the face of natural disaster, about how community sustains us when we're broken. Robert sat beside his mother in the pew, and he watched her experience this moment of being held by her community. It wasn't magical. It didn't undo the trauma or restore her house, but it provided something tangible, the knowledge that other people recognized her suffering and wanted to help. After the service, people approached Margaret with concrete offers. A contractor offered to assess the property for free. A builder offered a discount on materials. Volunteers signed up to help with the cleanup and documentation process. "See?" Linda whispered to Robert. "This is what faith does. It connects us to people who care." But Robert also noticed something else. Margaret seemed lighter when she left the church. Not happy. She was still grieving, still processing the loss, but lighter, as if some of the burden had been shared with others, distributed across the community instead of being carried alone. That evening, Margaret returned the Bible to the small shelf in the apartment. She didn't put it away completely, but she set it down instead of holding it constantly. "I think I understand now," she said to Robert. "The Bible survived not because God was protecting it specifically, but because of random chance. The angle of the debris, the position of the table, luck. But that doesn't make it meaningless. It reminds me that even in chaos, we can find things worth holding on to. We can choose to see meaning in what remains." November arrived cold and grey. The temporary apartment had begun to feel less temporary and more like their actual life, which created an unexpected tension within the family. Robert was spending most of his days with insurance adjusters and contractors. Linda had taken a part-time job to help with expenses while they waited for the full insurance payout. Sarah had returned to school, where she was experiencing a peculiar form of adolescent trauma, invisible to her classmates, who had no idea that her house had been destroyed, that she'd spent weeks in a basement shelter, that her life had been fundamentally altered. Margaret occupied a strange middle space. She'd found purpose in her community involvement with the church and in working with the architect on the house design. But at night, when everyone was asleep, Robert would occasionally find her sitting alone, staring at nothing. The first real argument came during a dinner where space was limited and emotions were high. "I don't understand why we're not looking at properties in Arizona," Sarah said, pushing food around her plate. "Aunt Jennifer said she could help us find something there, somewhere that doesn't have tornado season." "Because this is our home," Linda said firmly. "Oklahoma is our home. You were born here. Your school is here. Your father's job is here." "My job was here," Robert clarified. "The construction company I worked for is gone. The offices were destroyed. They're relocating to Kansas City." This was news he hadn't fully discussed with the family yet. He'd been offered a position with the company in Kansas City, which would actually be a promotion. It was also, he'd been slowly realizing, an escape route. "So we could move," Sarah pressed. "We could actually do it." "We could," Robert agreed. "But your mother is right. This is our home. This is where your grandmother lives, where we have community support, where we get destroyed by tornadoes." Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp with teenage anger. "Where we lost everything. Why would we stay?" Margaret set down her fork. "Because running away from where we're from doesn't solve the problem of living," she said quietly. "Terrible things happen everywhere. You can move to Arizona and experience an earthquake. You can move to the coast and experience a hurricane. You can move anywhere and experience some form of disaster. The question isn't whether you can find a place where bad things never happen. The question is whether you want to be in a place where you have people who will help you through the bad things when they do happen. That's easy for you to say, Sarah said, her voice wavering. You're old. You've had a full life. If something happens to me, I haven't had anything yet. The silence that followed was sharp and painful. Linda reached for Sarah's hand, but Sarah pulled away. I need air, Sarah said, leaving the table. After she left, Robert, Linda, and Margaret sat in uncomfortable silence. She's struggling, Linda said finally. She's been so strong, but she's struggling. She's 16, Margaret said. She's supposed to struggle. She's supposed to want to run away. That's developmentally appropriate. But she's running away from the wrong things, Robert said. She's running away from her grief, not towards something better. That evening, Robert found Sarah on the small balcony of the apartment, looking out at the November evening. Can I sit? Robert asked. Sarah nodded without turning around. They sat in silence for a while. Robert had learned, through therapy and through experience, that sometimes silence was more important than words. I'm scared, Sarah said finally. I know I'm supposed to be brave like Grandma. I know I'm supposed to understand that we survived, and that means we should be grateful. But I'm just scared. I'm scared that if we rebuild, another tornado will come and destroy it again. I'm scared that if we stay here, I'll never feel safe. I'm scared that if we leave, I'll be running away from something I should be facing. Robert listened to his daughter articulate the thing he'd been feeling but hadn't been able to name. You know what I realized, Robert said. Fear is smart. Fear is supposed to happen after something traumatic. Your brain is trying to protect you by reminding you that terrible things are possible. That's not weakness. That's actually appropriate. So, what do I do with it? Sarah asked. You feel it, Robert said. You acknowledge it, and then you decide anyway what you want to do. You don't let fear make the decision, but you don't ignore it either. You let it inform your choices. That sounds exhausting, Sarah said. It is, Robert agreed, but it's also how you become an adult. You learn to live with fear without being controlled by it. December brought a different kind of challenge, the holidays. This would be the first Christmas in 40 years that Margaret would not spend in her house. The first time they wouldn't have the ritual of decorating the large tree in the front window, of hanging stockings on the fireplace mantel, of hosting family dinners in the dining room. Linda tried to create normalcy by bringing some of the traditional decorations to the temporary apartment, but a small artificial tree in a rental living room was not the same as the full rituals they'd observed for decades. Margaret spent a day at the rubble site, which had now been cleared of most debris, but still held the foundation and some scattered remnants. The city did a clean-up, the site manager explained to her, but we found some items that might have sentimental value. They're in this storage unit over here. He opened a small metal storage container, and Margaret felt her breath catch. There, carefully sorted and placed on shelves, were items that had somehow survived the tornado. A music box that had belonged to her mother, several photographs in damaged frames, a porcelain figurine collection, miraculously mostly intact, a set of dishes that had been in her china cabinet. These were the pieces of her material life that the tornado hadn't taken, and seeing them was somehow harder than accepting their loss would have been. We can have these delivered to your temporary residence, the manager offered, if you'd like them. Margaret arranged for the items to be stored until the new house was completed, but the experience of seeing them had shaken something loose in her emotional equilibrium. That evening she sat with Robert and Linda and talked about grief. I thought I was done grieving, Margaret said. I thought I'd accepted the loss, understood that things are just things, moved on. But seeing those items, I realized I hadn't processed anything. I'd just been pushing forward. That's not unusual, Linda said gently. Grief isn't linear. It comes and goes. The thing that's hard is that I have to grieve the same loss twice, Margaret continued. Once for the life I had and the memories attached to the house. And again now, because these few pieces being found doesn't undo that. The rest of my mother's dishes are gone. The photographs I can't replace are gone. The quilt my grandmother made is gone. They're gone. And these few pieces being found doesn't undo that. Robert put his arm around his mother. You're allowed to grieve however you need to. I know, Margaret said, but I'm also supposed to be the strong one. I'm supposed to be the one who has faith that everything will be okay. But everything isn't okay. My home is gone. My possessions are scattered or destroyed, and I'm tired of pretending to be stronger than I am. The structural engineer's report came back with the conclusion everyone expected. The house was unsalvageable. The foundation had shifted. The load-bearing walls were compromised. Demolition was the only option. Robert scheduled the demolition for a Saturday in October, 6 weeks after the tornado. Margaret asked if she could be there. They stood on the lot where the house had been, now just a pile of rubble and broken dreams. A team of workers with heavy equipment arrived to clear the debris, separate salvageable materials from waste, begin the process of erasing what had been. Margaret watched silently as the machinery began its work. Robert put his arm around his mother, and they stood together as the past was systematically dismantled. "What will you do?" Margaret asked. "Build the same house? Build something different?" "I don't know yet," Robert said. "We've been approved for the insurance money, which is good, but we have to decide. Do we rebuild on this lot, or do we move somewhere else? Do we try to recreate what was, or do we create something new? What does Linda want? She wants to rebuild here. This is our home, and she wants to restore it. Sarah wants to move somewhere less vulnerable to storms, maybe closer to Linda's sister in Arizona. Robert trailed off. "I want things to go back to the way they were, but I know that's not possible." Margaret nodded. "Nothing ever goes back to the way it was. We only move forward. Sometimes forward looks like rebuilding in the same place. Sometimes it looks like starting somewhere new, but it's always forward." That afternoon, Robert met with an architect to discuss rebuilding options. The architect, a woman named Patricia, who specialized in tornado-resistant construction, showed him several designs. She talked about reinforced foundations, strengthened roof attachments, interior safe rooms built to withstand extreme winds. "You can't make a house tornado-proof," Patricia explained, "but you can make it much more resistant. You can design it so that even in a worst-case scenario, people have a better chance of survival." Robert found himself drawn to this approach. Not rebuilding what was lost, but building something stronger, something designed specifically to weather future storms. He brought the designs home and spread them across the dining table. Linda came and looked at them with interest. Sarah came and examined them with skepticism. "It looks different," Sarah said. "It doesn't look like our house." "No," Robert agreed, "but it will be our house, a new one we design." Over the next month, Robert worked with Patricia to develop a design that incorporated Patricia's tornado-resistant principles, but also maintained some connection to the original house's character. They kept the brick exterior, the general shape, some architectural elements that had mattered to Robert's family. But inside, the layout was different. The safe room was now a central core of the house instead of a basement. The roof was reinforced. The windows were stronger. The structure, while it looked similar to the casual observer, was fundamentally different, built for resilience instead of just aesthetics. Margaret was involved in every decision. She wanted to make sure that the new house, while modern and stronger, still held space for the things that had mattered in the old house, a place in the kitchen for the family photos, a window in the bedroom where she could see the sunrise, a shelf in the living room specifically designed to display her Bible. "This book survived for a reason," Margaret said, running her hand along the shelf they were designing. "Not because God protected it supernaturally, but because it's important. It's part of who we are. The new house should acknowledge that." The construction took 8 months. Robert watched his house being rebuilt from the ground up. He helped with decisions, consulted with the contractors, learned more about construction than he'd ever expected to know. Linda worked with the designer on the interior. She made choices about color and layout, creating a home that was new but still felt familiar. Sarah gradually became less resistant to the process. She helped choose her bedroom design, picked out paint colors, came to see this as an opportunity to create something fresh instead of just losing something old. Margaret spent time at the construction site. The workers came to know her, to expect her there on Saturday mornings with coffee and donuts. She told them about the original house, about the history of the property, about her grandchildren who'd played in that yard. One of the construction workers, a man named Jason who was doing the carpentry work, built a special bookcase for Margaret's Bible. It was beautiful, crafted from reclaimed wood that had come from the original house's framework. The Bible would sit there on that shelf, a physical reminder of what had survived and what they were building from the remains. When the house was completed, the family held a small celebration. Margaret stood at the edge of the property, looking at the new house, and Robert saw tears in her eyes. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I wasn't sure I'd ever feel at home again," Margaret said. "After the tornado, I thought that feeling was gone forever. That you could only be at home in one place, and once that place was destroyed, you were lost." She looked at her son. "But standing here, looking at this house that we built together, with all of you, I realize that home isn't about the structure. It's about who's in it and what you choose to make of it." She walked toward the front door, and Robert followed. Inside, the house smelled like fresh paint and new construction. The furniture was still being arranged. The walls were bare. It didn't yet feel like home, but it would. In time, as they lived in it, as they made memories in this new space, it would become home. Not the same as before. Different, but perhaps stronger. Built with intention, designed for resilience, created from the understanding that storms would come, but that they would endure. Robert found Margaret standing in front of the bookshelf where her Bible now sat. She picked up the leather-bound book and held it for a moment, then placed it back on the shelf. "I used to think this book survived the tornado because God was protecting it," Margaret said, "because my faith was strong enough, but I don't think that anymore. I think it survived because of chance, because of physics, because of the angle of falling wood. And that's okay. That's enough." She turned to Robert. "What saved us wasn't divine intervention. It was community. The firefighters who found us, the neighbors who helped, the church that supported us. It was love. You and Linda staying together through this, Sarah being brave. It was resilience, choosing to rebuild instead of collapse. That's what saved us. That's what faith really is, trusting that we can survive what comes and help each other do it." Robert embraced his mother, and together they stood in their new home, in the beginning of whatever came next. February arrived cold and grey. The house had been lived in for almost a year now. The walls had developed personality through family photos and artwork. The garden that Margaret and Linda had planted was beginning to mature. Sarah's room was a testament to teenage independence, filled with the detritus of her life, clothes, books, posters, the visible chaos of becoming an adult. Robert stood on the front porch on a Tuesday afternoon, watching a storm develop in the distance. The sky was that familiar green color. The sirens weren't sounding, the storm was still far away, but Robert felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that now accompanied severe weather. Margaret came out onto the porch and stood beside him. She'd developed a ritual of storm watching since the tornado. She said it helped her accept the reality of living in Oklahoma, where severe weather was part of life. "Think it will hit us?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," Robert said. "Maybe, but we're ready this time." They stood together, watching the storm approach and eventually veer away, missing their house entirely. When the danger had passed, Margaret went inside and returned with 2 cups of coffee. "I've been thinking about writing something," Margaret said as they sat on the porch. "About what happened, about the house, the Bible, all of it. I want to document it, so that your grandchildren will know what we went through and how we survived." "That's a good idea," Robert said. "People should know. They should know that sometimes really terrible things happen," Margaret continued, "and they should know that you survived them. not because of divine intervention or because you're specially blessed, but because you have people who love you, because you're willing to work hard to rebuild, because community holds you up. That's the real story. That's what I want them to understand." Robert smiled. His mother, 83 years old, had been broken by a tornado and was now finding meaning in that brokenness. She was choosing to see the survival as evidence of human resilience rather than divine protection. It was, Robert thought, a much more powerful statement of faith than any miracle story could be. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Robert reflected on everything that had happened: the tornado, the loss, the rebuilding, the family coming together, the community support, the understanding that life continued, that they could grieve and still move forward, that home was something you built together, not something that could be taken away. The Bible still sat on Margaret's shelf in the living room, a reminder of what had survived the chaos. But it was just a book now, a meaningful book, but not a magical one. Its survival was luck, not providence, but somehow that made it more precious, not less. The house around them was proof of what they could build from destruction, not the same as before, but perhaps something stronger, something made with intention, shaped by understanding, created in community with others who cared. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, Robert thought, everything.